At Central Line Terminal, where the pulse of the city met the quiet arrival of weary travelers, 32-year-old security officer Jordan Taylor started his evening shift. He had been working here for nearly 7 years, watching the ebb and flow of countless faces. But tonight, as he surveyed the terminal bustling with hurried commuters and expectant families, his attention snagged on an unexpected sight: a lone woman, perhaps in her early 70s, sitting near Gate C. She wore a neatly pressed gray dress, her silver hair impeccably styled, and in her hands, she held a bouquet of lilies, their white petals beginning to curl and fade. Something about her presence was hard to ignore, like an unfinished melody hanging in the air. She seemed almost frozen, a fragile figure amid the rush, her gaze fixed on the terminal doors with quiet determination. Jordan tried to dismiss the intrigue, telling himself she was likely just another traveler. But as the minutes ticked by, he found himself glancing back at her, drawn by a sense of unease he couldn't explain. Why was she sitting there, unmoving, her eyes filled with such desperate anticipation? Deciding it was worth a closer look, he approached her, offering a friendly greeting. "Ma'am, can I help you with anything?" She looked up, startled but polite, her voice soft and tremulous, as she explained she was waiting for someone very dear to her, someone she hadn't seen in decades. The simple response stirred a strange feeling in him. When she politely declined further assistance, he walked away, but the image of her frail figure and weary eyes lingered, pulling at him like an unfinished thought. Over the next few hours, Jordan continued his rounds, but the image of the elderly woman remained in his mind, casting a shadow on his usual routine. Each time he passed Gate C, there she was, still waiting, still hopeful. As the night wore on and the crowds thinned, he found himself approaching her once more, unable to ignore the growing feeling that something was amiss. The conversation that followed would set in motion a series of events that neither Jordan nor the waiting woman could have anticipated. Little did Jordan know, this encounter would lead him to a disturbing truth, and he would have to act quickly to prevent an unfolding tragedy. As dawn crept over Central Line Terminal, casting a soft glow through the towering glass walls, Jordan found himself pacing near Gate C once more. He had tried to dismiss his concerns, to focus on his duties, but the image of the elderly woman stayed lodged in his mind, relentless. She was still there, now looking even more weary. Her elegant gray dress, once crisp, was now slightly wrinkled, and the bouquet of lilies seemed more wilted, as if echoing the woman's silent vigil. Despite his instinct to approach her again, Jordan hesitated. Security officers were taught not to interfere with travelers unless there was a clear reason, but watching her sitting there, seemingly lost and fragile, made him question that policy. Finally, he couldn't resist any longer. With a determined sigh, Jordan approached the woman again. She looked up, her eyes holding a glimmer of hope that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Ma'am," he began gently, "I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting here for quite some time. Are you sure there isn't anything I can help you with?" She gave him a tired smile, almost as if trying to reassure him instead of herself. "I'm waiting for my friend," she replied, pausing with a hesitation that only added to Jordan's unease. We haven't seen each other in many years. He promised he'd come today." Jordan's heart sank slightly. There was something about her tone, a mix of anticipation and doubt, that stirred a pang of empathy within him. He asked her softly, "Has he let you know if he's on his way?" She shook her head, clutching her phone tightly, the screen dim. "No, but I'm sure he'll be here. He wouldn't let me down," she whispered, more to herself than to Jordan. Jordan nodded, sensing the depth of her trust, but feeling a wave of apprehension rise within him. Was this woman simply hopeful, or was she holding on to something more fragile, something he couldn't yet understand? As the hours passed, Jordan continued his rounds, his thoughts frequently returning to the elderly woman near Gate C. The terminal had quieted, with only a few travelers lingering, and soon Jordan found himself passing by her once more. She was still there, her expression now a mixture of exhaustion and subtle panic. He approached her yet again, sensing the worry deepen in her gaze as she glanced repeatedly at the terminal doors. "Ma'am," he said quietly, trying to offer a sense of calm. "Maybe we could contact your friend to see if he's on his way. Or if he's delayed." She seemed to consider his suggestion, her eyes momentarily brightening with relief. But then she shook her head, her voice wavering. I'm afraid I don't have his current number. But he told me to wait for him here. He promised." It was that word, promised, that sent a shiver down Jordan's spine. The way she clung to it, as if it were her last tether, seemed both touching and troubling. He stepped back, giving her some space, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Jordan made a decision then. If she was still there by the end of his shift, he would intervene, protocol or no protocol. Something in his gut told him this situation wasn't just a simple meeting gone awry. This woman's unwavering faith hinted at a story far more complex and possibly heartbreaking. The clock struck noon, and the once crowded terminal had now settled into a quiet lull, save for a few travelers rushing to catch their flights. Jordan's shift was almost over, but as he glanced toward Gate C, he felt a pang of responsibility. There she was, the elderly woman, still waiting, her expression now clouded with worry and fatigue. Her once hopeful posture had slumped, and her hands, still clutching the wilting bouquet, trembled slightly. She seemed lost, even vulnerable, as if she was holding on to a distant memory rather than expecting someone tangible to walk through the doors. Determined to help, Jordan approached her once more, this time with gentle but direct concern. "Ma'am," he said softly, kneeling down to meet her at eye level. "I think we should try to figure out what's going on here. Do you have any way of reaching your friend, perhaps through a family member or someone else who knows him?" She looked at him, her eyes welling with tears, and for a moment, she seemed to consider his words. Then, as if admitting a painful truth she had tried to ignore, she nodded slowly. "Actually, we haven't met in person yet," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We met online. He's supposed to be coming from far away." Jordan's heart sank as he pieced together the implications. She was here, waiting, because she genuinely believed in this stranger's promises. "Ma'am," he began cautiously, trying not to shatter her hopes. "Did he ask you for anything specific? Maybe for you to bring something with you?" She hesitated, glancing at the small handbag by her side, then nodded, her face turning a shade of embarrassed pink. "Yes. He asked me to bring a bit of money," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "He said he needed help covering some unexpected expenses for his trip." Jordan felt a wave of sadness mixed with anger. He had encountered stories like this before, where lonely people fell prey to scammers who feigned affection and connection for their own gain. But seeing it in person, seeing this woman holding on to hope so tightly, made it all the more painful. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Ma'am, I don't want to alarm you, but I think it's possible that this person might not be who he says he is." Her face fell, and he could see her struggling to process his words. She blinked, as if trying to wake up from a dream. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "He wouldn't lie to me. He told me everything about his life, his dreams. He even sent me photos." She fumbled for her phone, scrolling through messages filled with words of affection, images of a man she had come to trust. Jordan looked at her, heart heavy, not wanting to destroy the fragile happiness she clung to, but knowing he had no choice. "Ma'am," he said as gently as he could, "these people often create fake personas online. They use these methods to manipulate, to gain trust." She stared at him, horror dawning in her eyes as reality began to settle in. The light in her gaze dimmed, and her fingers tightened around the wilting lilies as if trying to hold on to one last shred of hope. Jordan called his supervisor and explained the situation. Soon, a small team arrived to provide support. The elderly woman, who had introduced herself as Eleanor, was guided to a quiet area where she was gently informed about the possibility of fraud. As each piece of information was revealed, the weight of betrayal seemed to press down on her shoulders, and the bouquet of lilies lay forgotten on the bench. She sat there, stunned, her mind racing to reconcile the beautiful dreams she had believed in with the cruel reality now staring back at her. Jordan sat by her side, offering silent support as she began to understand the depth of the deception she had faced. A quiet resolve grew within him to ensure that she would not face this heartbreak alone. Whatever it took, he would help her through this painful awakening, ensuring that the world's cruelty wouldn't extinguish her spirit. The terminal's hum seemed to fade into silence as Eleanor absorbed the truth. Her hands trembled as she clutched the bag beside her, the bag containing the money she had saved to help the man she thought would be her future. Jordan stayed beside her, his presence steady and reassuring as she grappled with the weight of betrayal. For Eleanor, it felt as though the world she had so carefully built in her heart had shattered, each piece falling away with a painful clarity. "I don't understand." "How could he?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. She stared at the wilted lilies, now symbolic of her dashed hopes, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "We talked for hours. He made me feel seen, loved even. I was so sure this was real." Jordan took a deep breath, his own heart heavy as he watched her wrestle with emotions of shame, sorrow, and anger. "Eleanor," he said softly, "this happens to a lot of people. It doesn't mean you were foolish. It means you have a kind heart, one that wanted to believe in love and connection. There's nothing wrong with that." Eleanor looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and pain in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, struggling to find words. I thought I'd finally found someone who cared." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue Jordan handed her. "After my husband passed away, it's been so lonely. I guess I was ready to believe in anyone who'd say the right words." Jordan's gaze softened, understanding the depth of her loneliness. "You're not alone in this," he assured her. "There are people who care, people who want to help. We can report this together and make sure no one else falls victim to this." As they spoke, a quiet strength began to return to Eleanor's posture. She nodded slowly, as if finding a small piece of herself she thought had been lost. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," she said, her voice steadier now. Jordan felt a swell of respect for her resilience. Despite her heartbreak, Eleanor was already thinking of others. He guided her to the airport support office, where staff members offered resources, including connections to support groups for victims of online scams and therapy options. Over the next few hours, with Jordan's assistance, Eleanor began the process of filing a report. It was painful, reliving every detail, recounting every message and promise. But with each step, she seemed to regain a little more strength. Jordan stayed by her side, offering quiet encouragement, his own commitment to helping her unwavering. By the end of the process, Eleanor's face bore the marks of exhaustion, yet there was also a sense of closure in her eyes. "I can't thank you enough, Jordan," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "You didn't have to do all this for me, a stranger. But you did." Jordan smiled gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Eleanor, you're not just a stranger. You're someone who needed help, and I was lucky enough to be there. Don't let this experience change the goodness in you. The world needs that kindness." As evening settled over the city, Eleanor stood outside Centraline Terminal with Jordan by her side. The bouquet of lilies, though wilted and fragile, was still clutched in her hands. It had been a long, emotional day, but now there was a glimmer of resilience in her eyes, a quiet determination that had replaced the earlier sorrow. She took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs, and looked up at Jordan with a soft smile. "Thank you, Jordan," she said, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "I came here today thinking I was finally going to meet someone who cared. And in a way, I did. Just not in the way I expected." She glanced at the lilies, a small, bittersweet smile touching her lips. Maybe these flowers aren't just for him. Maybe they're for everyone who has felt lost and alone, like me. Jordan nodded, deeply moved by her words. "Eleanor, what happened today might have started as something painful, but it's also shown how resilient you are. You faced something heartbreaking and found the courage to keep going. That's no small thing." She looked at him, her expression softening as she took in the weight of his words. "I think you're right. Today isn't an end. It's a beginning." They shared a quiet moment, watching as travelers moved past, each lost in their own stories and journeys. Eleanor no longer felt like one of those stories had to be hers, tied to empty promises. She was ready to move forward, carrying the memories of those she had loved, but no longer burdened by the need for validation from strangers. Jordan handed her a card with his contact information, a reminder that she wasn't alone. "If you ever need a friend or just someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Eleanor smiled, tucking the card into her bag. "You've been a true friend today, Jordan. I'll never forget that." With one last grateful glance, she turned and walked away from the terminal, her steps steady and sure. Jordan watched her go, feeling a sense of pride and relief. He had been a part of her healing, a reminder that kindness could transform even the darkest situations. As Eleanor's story reminds us, life is filled with both beautiful connections and unexpected heartbreaks. But through courage, resilience, and a little help from those around us, we can always find our way back to hope. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to our channel for more inspiring tales of compassion and strength. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that could change your perspective, or perhaps your life. Thank you for being here, and remember, every act of kindness has the power to create a brighter world.